Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Charles. And thank you to ISA for inviting the OAS to be part of this session. I think what we want to try and do during my presentation and the short time that we have is to actually set the scene on data privacy and to begin to pull the intersection with cybersecurity. And then I think Bartlett will follow after in terms of just looking at the topic from a more localized or national perspective. As the OAS, it's important to first say thank you again, and just express that everything that's represented here is the views of my own and not that of the organization or its member states. It's absolutely necessary to just give that disclaimer, and that will allow us to have a more fruitful discussion as well. So I wanted to probably start off by saying what the global view looks like with data privacy. At the heart of it, currently, we have many countries who started to uptake in terms of having data privacy legislation, data protection legislation. In 2018, you might be wondering what would have happened. And in 2018, there was this trigger effect, I would probably call it, where the GDPR came out, and that's the Global Data Protection Regulation out of Europe came out. And what it did is that a lot of organizations who were responsible for handling data for the EU was required to begin to put regulations in place. So data protection and privacy now became more important to businesses across the globe, not only with Europe, but pretty much everyone because of the hefty fines that was coming about. So data privacy is not a concept that I think just grew suddenly over the last, I think, 3 years, which now everyone's attention. It's something that actually spurred out of a more global event that was happening. And one of the things that's important to probably highlight from the statistics I showed before globally is that of 194 countries that UNCTAD looked at, we have 128 who've begun to put legislation in place. And data privacy, there's become an increased need for regulation because of the type of personal data that's happening and the fact that there is an increasing number of data flows happening globally. COVID has become a reality for everyone, and automatically, if you think about COVID and what has happened to the world, usually we would have our data in files in a cabinet somewhere. If you wanted to go to the Ministry of Health, if you wanted to go to a health center, education, you'd physically walk in and hand in a paper. With COVID as an example, a lot of our governments had to automatically digitize, and it now forces governments, entities who are providing services on behalf of government to begin to think through how are we utilizing these data, how are we transferring this data, how are we monetizing this data. On the regional level, if we kind of take it a notch down, we have many of our countries right around Barbados who've started to look on this issue and who've started to actually put regulations in place. Barbados is actually one of the leading ones in terms of addressing this aggressively, because Jamaica and Barbados in December last year started to actually say, we need a data commissioner. And a data commissioner being here on this is, I think it's significant for us to recognize how Barbados takes this seriously. In the Americas total, there are 35 countries with some form of legislation either in draft or actually are there. And one of the things that's important is you have countries such as Trinidad and Tobago who passed theirs in 2011. You have Bermuda, Cayman Islands, who have actually begun to do this as well. So data privacy is not just a local regulatory concept. It's something that is actually taking over the region based on that global impact that's happening. What are some of the challenges that are being faced? It's regulators across the globe are now having to think about how do we balance the issues that we know exist? We have access issues, privacy issues. We need our governments to grow. We have to be part of the global picture in terms of digitization and offering digital services for efficiency, transparency, economic savings. We also have cross-border transfers because of all the global relationships we have. And now there's a natural intersection that's also happening with cybercrime, where because of all of those data flows, we now have to think about safeguarding data, safeguarding our interests. And then law enforcement officers are also faced, how do we balance public good, public safety, and the need for persons to have privacy and their data protected? Another quick thing to just highlight is that persons are also trying to figure out how to actually craft their regulations for the good of the nation. How do we ensure that we have a digital infrastructure that's rolled out to maximize our input as Barbados in the global picture and being a player on the global market, while ensuring that our data is being managed properly and knowing who's managing our data? What does this mean for you as an individual? And I think it's thinking about the fact that the pandemic has also increased the impetus to introduce these new e-services and solutions, and governments are now forced to share health information globally because of the pandemic. Websites, social platforms, all of this has become pretty much exasperated because of the pandemic. In terms of you as an individual, it also means that the laws actually help you to think about how you protect your data. And you have to think about how it is that you interact with persons who are regulating and enforcing this. And most importantly, for you as an individual, you have to think about, I'm a data owner. How do I ensure when I go onto my social media networks, I go on to government websites, I go on to business websites, and it has these privacy options, am I actually seeing what the cookies are and actually clicking and reading? As a data owner, it means that it's not just the regulator who has to protect your data. You as the owner who gives that data have to think about it as well. Just to consider, from CPAL 2020 has an entire document on data privacy. And one of the things that they have highlighted when you think about you as the individual is the right to privacy is linked to the exercise of other rights that depend on the ability to determine how one's personal information is used and shared. And I would dare say how it's shared is also dependent on you as well as the data owner. I want to do this intersection, as I said, between privacy and cybersecurity, and to challenge those of you who are on the call or on the meeting right now with us that there is a complete intersection. Cybersecurity usually have these three fundamentals: the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Data protection and data privacy regulations focus on similar things. They want to ensure that, one, your data is secure and private. Only those who should have access to your data need to have access to your data. Integrity, it means that data privacy and protection legislation try to ensure that your data has integrity. No matter when you come and touch the data, it should be the same type of data that's there. It's not tampered with. And availability, ensuring that you have cybersecurity measures in place, that your information is accessible and it's not being able to be accessed by unauthorized persons. What does that mean for your organization? At a global, I think, a more macro level, is that we need to think about strengthening our legal and institutional frameworks, both as regulators and government entities and businesses. We need to promote education. We need to develop security and privacy policies and best practices, implement security features. And as I kind of close my presentation, because so we don't have a lot of time because we want to have time for question and answer, is to also suggest to you that you consider adopting some global guidances, such as the NIST privacy framework, which was published in 2020. This framework, as I wrap up, I wanted to end with it because I think it's important for you to realize that as Barbados starts this journey and your data commissioner begins to form and shape what the regulatory framework and environment will look like, it's important to start recognizing that the legislation itself is not a one-stop shop. You have to do something. And starting to identify, govern, control, communicate how you do this and protect the information that you own is important. And to be warned that even when you put this in, it does not guarantee compliance. It does not guarantee that you'll be able to protect data completely, but it's a good start. And I think with that, Charles, I hope I made it 10 minutes. I wasn't able to see the timer, but I'll stop here and then at least allow time for question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kerry-Ann. And we'll go on to Bartlett, and then we'll come back with a joint question and answer session for both of you. Okay, Bartlett, you're up next, so it's over to you. You're still muted.
Hi, thank you. I'm now trying to share my screen. Just give me a second. There we go. All right, so hi everyone. good afternoon, and I'd like to extend the gratitude to the organizers this evening for having me. I've been tasked with very briefly sort of doing two things, making the connection between the seminal, well, the major topic tonight, which is, you know, issues around ransomware and so on, and the overarching space of privacy and data protection. And in doing so, what I want to do is to also just very briefly, just to give consideration to the local landscape, as it were. Now, so this is essentially what I want to cover off very briefly in my comments. Now, I want to look on the Barbados position, as I mentioned. I want to connect ransomware and, you know, cyber incidents generally with the notion of breaches. We want to look at the question of, well, if there is a breach, well, who do you notify? And then we also want to look at some legal considerations around determining whether or not you ought to pay a breach, pay the ransomware in the event that that kind of event has occurred within your organization. Now, to cover off the Barbados position, now I think it's I think fairly apparent that Barbados has been doing quite a bit of work in the last few years to more or less put a kind of firm regulatory framework in place. And I think, you know, kudos to the government for having finally pushed things forward so that we now have not just an act on the books, but an act, the Barbados Data Protection Act, which is actually in force. And so as we speak right now, this is an act with live obligations for virtually the entire, for example, business community, and virtually anyone who processes personal data. Obviously, there are certain exceptions and so on, you know, domestic use and so on. But in large part, it now means that there are live obligations underneath this act. And a big part of why, naturally, I think most of us have started paying attention is because, well, there are fairly significant fines underneath this act in situations where there have been fairly significant breaches. And now, in a context where we now have a data protection commissioner appointed, it now means that if there has been a breach and an investigation has occurred and the regulator has satisfied herself of the breach, it's now theoretically possible for different kinds of penalties and fines to be levied. For instance, the Commissioner Graves will have the authority, for instance, to directly, having, you know, gone through the necessary steps, to deliver, to basically issue administrative penalties, which can go up to maybe 50,000 Barbados dollars, 25,000 US dollars, just for context. And then beyond that, if the criminal process is invoked, you could see yourself in a situation where you're left with fines in the range of $500,000 Barbados dollars. We look, you know, that's like 250,000 US dollars, which is, it's now moving you from the territory of this being a by the way consideration to it being a serious consideration from the perspective of just, you know, I guess managing risk within your organization and looking out for serious situations where breaches could result in serious fines. But even beyond that, I mean, if we're being frank, it's beyond just the possibility or the specter of fines from the regulator. The reality is most businesses are sufficiently or significantly enough digital in their operations so that where there is a sizable breach, it could potentially impact the goodwill associated with your brand in the public domain. And so you may find yourself in a situation where you are the subject of breaches or repeated breaches. And by virtue of that, it also potentially impacts your standing in the eyes of your potential consumers and customers who may now look to your competitors who they may perceive, whether rightfully or not, as potentially being more secure. And so the reality is this is now the new ball game in which we find ourselves in Barbados. Now, some of the more interesting aspects of the Act, which I'll get into a little bit more detail in the next slide or so, is that one of the major requirements that has been brought about by this Act is that if something goes wrong, you know how to tell somebody. And that's fairly significant from a regulatory perspective, that you know how to take certain positive steps. You know, the Act, I think, is also fairly significant because in the Barbados context, it makes a fairly clear distinction between persons who are the typical business members of the business community, for example, who will decide that, hey, I need my customers' data to do X, Y, or Z, or to achieve X, Y, or Z business objective. And in those situations, you are what the Act refers to as a data controller, as distinct from processors, which are really kind of third-party entities that you might engage to assist you with processing data for any purpose. And we're talking from when you're using Google Suite to when you hire some sophisticated back office entity, to using, the Amazon, sort of web services or anything of the sort. And so the point I think I want to sort of settle on in speaking to the Barbados position, so to speak, is that for years we've waited for this Act to be in place, and we've looked forward for a time when these regulations would be applicable, and that time is now. Not only is the Act enforceable, but now there is a regulator to do that enforcement in the person of Commissioner Graves. And so I think it's going to require a more sober kind of reflection for persons generally, and certainly within the business community, about how how you treat to issues around the security of personal data. And quite frankly, I think in the larger scheme of things, just your general cybersecurity posture, if we're being frank. Now, one of the key points that I think it's important to make is that realistically, if we are talking about ransomware, then the question then becomes, well, what exactly is ransomware? What are we referring to when we speak to ransomware? And can it be a breach within the definition of the Barbados Data Protection Act? And the short answer is invariably, in most cases, based on how our Act is formulated, where there's been some kind of a ransomware event, it's likely to constitute a breach within the meaning of our Barbados Data Protection Act. And therefore, potentially there are certain outcomes that may arise from that in terms of having to make a report to Commissioner Graves, or in some circumstances to the data subjects who've been affected. Now, I say that to say, and I'm going to read out the definition for you. A breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. Now, if you sit with that definition for a while, you realize it's fairly broad. And so invariably, I think it's fairly apparent that, in fact, yes, if you do have some kind of ransomware type event within your organization, it probably constitutes a breach within the context or meaning of the Barbados Data Protection Act. And therefore, it therefore means that there are certain obligations that are likely to be triggered, and in particular, an obligation to notify the regulators, plural. Now, as I would have briefly foreshadowed before, the primary regulator you'd think about is, well, the Data Protection Commissioner, because the Act says so, that you have to notify the regulator in the context of a breach. But in addition to that, depending on the sector that you are in, there may be other regulators that you might have to report to. And I'm thinking, for example, of if you're operating in the financial services space, odds are, based on the regulations that play in that space, and I'm using that as an example, you might be required to report the breach depending on the severity of it and the degree to which it might impact your bottom line and so on. You might need to report that breach to the FSC, for example, the Financial Services Commission, or the Central Bank of Barbados. And so the point to be made is, it's going to be very important in the event of a breach to think really clearly about the size, the scope, the severity of the breach, and what that means for reporting the breach. Because not all breaches are necessarily reportable events, but it must meet a certain standard that has been outlined in the Barbados Data Protection Act. Now, my time is running out, so I won't go into perhaps too much detail there, but I'll go on to say that similarly, if you meet the particular threshold outlined in the Act, then you're likely to have an obligation to say something to the particular data subject if there has been a breach that impacts them. Now, the final point, which I really want to touch on really quickly, is the question of the pay or not to pay. Now, as many of you may know, and when there's been a ransomware attack, the very purpose of it is that you will at some point make a payment to the bad actors who've carried out the ransomware attack in return for them giving you back access to or control over your data and our systems. Right? Now, that being the case, the question then goes, well, should I pay or shouldn't I pay? And interestingly enough, strictly speaking, just under the black letter of the law, it is not illegal, technically speaking, to make a ransomware payment for Barbados-based persons or businesses. It's not illegal. But that said, it is important to be mindful nonetheless and to think through carefully the repercussions, because if only theoretically, there are certain circumstances that have to do with the identity of the persons behind the ransomware attack and so on, that may lead you to a situation where you might find yourself in some kind of legal difficulty where you've attempted to make the payment. And I say that with reference to things like sanction lists and watch lists. Now, in brief, Barbados has passed some laws which basically mean that if there is an organization that's deemed, for example, a terrorist organization, and it's therefore on certain specified UN sanctions lists and watch lists and so on, then strictly speaking, if the payment you're making is to an entity like that or a person like that, and you are aware of it, which is a key point, then strictly speaking, you might be in breach of those laws that are enforced in Barbados. And that's a general gist of it. And so I think the bigger point to be made is when you do find yourself in a ransomware situation, it may not just be a case anymore of simply saying, well, let's pay it and get it over with. You might still need to do some amount of meaningful due diligence in that kind of situation to cover off some of the potential legal risks that might arise. And I think right now, I just read my timer go off, so I think now is a good time to put a bookend on my contributions tonight. Thank you again for having me.
All right, Bartlett, thank you very much. And Kerry-Anny, thank you so much as well. I'm going to kick off the questions with this particular one. We all remember that we are within the context of CARICOM, and with the whole hope of CARICOM integration, Caribbean integration, and CARICOM taking full effect right across the region. We know that the GDPR has been held up as the gold standard. My question really is, as it relates to the data privacy laws within the Caribbean, is there a need for harmonization between these laws, or are they good enough as they are by themselves? And I'm speaking in the context that should there be, because of the nature of CARICOM, the CARICOM companies that will share information between them, we wouldn't want a situation where that there's an exposure in one island, and let's say persons in Barbados have their data exposed, but there is not the same kind of protection in that island as there is in Barbados. So is there a need? How important is the whole question of harmonization? And any one of you can take it.
I think we could piggyback on each other and do the same kind of regional, global, and then kind of more localized context. Agreed with you. The GDPR has been held up as the gold standard, but what has been good, Charles, is that it has caused many countries have begun to adopt similar definitions for like what is personal identifiable information. And that's a good start. And if I think historically, all the way back in 2011, 2012, when Barbados was a part of the HIPCAR project and many of our other smaller islands were part of the EAGRE project, there was a model legislation developed for data privacy and protection. For example, Trinidad had used that model. I know Barbados started with that model. I haven't compared the latest or the final version that was approved to see if it ended up being that. But there is a need for some amount of harmonization. But thinking about it from the perspective of reciprocity within some of the other relationships that we do have, and in terms of definitions, I think the taxonomy is what's going to be more critical in terms of, I call an apple an apple. So when we both say our apple has been lost, we're talking about the same thing. Bartlett, I don't know what you think.
Yes, completely agreed. I won't get into the politics of whether or not what's ideal or not, but just from a practical perspective, right? There are a number of certain, I think, benefits you could identify if there was a kind of homogenized sort of framework that operated across the region in respect of data privacy, whether that's at the treaty level or just passing almost identical type legislation to deal with data privacy issues. There are a number of benefits. Certainly, and we've been practical here. I mean, obviously, from a business perspective, if you're doing business in the region, it allows for much greater predictability. If you know exactly that an apple means an apple in Jamaica, and it also means the same apple in Guyana. Those things are good for business. And if there's a singular framework, it also creates greater efficiencies and by extension, arguably greater free flows of data, which is what you want to encourage in this new kind of very digital centric economy or economic space that we find ourselves in. And another really practical reason why I think some kind of homogeneity might be good is from the perspective of enforcement. One of the practical things that governments have in the region is, yes, they agree that privacy is important to customers and citizens and so on, and even to the business community and everyone. But when you actually go about actually putting the piece together and resourcing, for example, the regulators, everyone realizes, wait, this is a bit more expensive than we thought. And then you find a lot of things kind of falling by the wayside. If, for example, there was a singular regulator in the privacy space, for example, that's a quick example, it would make it a lot more cost effective for each individual government to contribute towards the cost of enforcement. And so I do think there is potential significant value in having some kind of sort of singular space or a homogenized approach to data protection.
Okay, thanks. I have a question from the audience, and it relates to persons inquiring, what has been the fallout from the famously reported breach of the Jam COVID app, which exposed travelers' sensitive data, which was publicly available on an InSecure channel? And the other part of that question is, how does the Data Protection Act address such an incident?
Well, I mean, so I'll start by saying my colleagues in Jamaica have spent the better part of the past few months debating whether or not it was in fact a breach or it was merely a cyber incident that didn't rise to the level of a breach. And that debate, beyond just being intellectually stimulating, is important because depending on what you define the nature of the beast to be, that is what will determine certain consequences. And this kind of leads to the second part of the question about data protection. So if, let's say in a Barbados context, for example, underneath the Barbados legislation, based on a fairly wide definition that we apply in Barbados, it's more likely than not that it would potentially have been deemed a breach. And if it were deemed a breach, then kind of similar to what I would have discussed during the body of my presentation, my short presentation earlier, depending if it was a breach within the meaning of the act, then it's very likely that it would probably meet the threshold that would require you to notify the regulator. If you notify the regulator, then there are a number of things that can come from that, the most significant being that it's possible that the regulator may choose within her discretion to investigate. Depending on what the investigation turns up, there might be further penalties or enforcement steps taken. That is the essence of it.
All right, Kerry-Anny, you want to add anything in terms of from your perspective on the question of, that question related? Do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think Bartlett covered it probably thoroughly more than I could, given my role.
Okay, all right.
I'll hide behind his legal shield right now.
Okay, all right. We've got another question. Bartlett, this one might be more suited to you. Is how effective is the data privacy law? How can this be enforced when some companies don't like the scrutiny of the breaches and prefer to sweep them under the carpet?
Oh, loaded question. What I will say is this. I mean, it's hard to say how effective a regime is without having seen the regime at work. the regime is new. The data protection regime in Barbados is new. We've just had a regulator appointed. We haven't gone about doing certain basic things as yet. Sensitizing the public about their rights so that they know when there's a breach of some issue that affects them, that kind of thing. We don't know any of that yet, and so all we can really do is speculate. What I would say, though, in that vein is that, I mean, objectively on paper, the content of the act, if we use that as a basis for our assessment of its effect. My apologies. I'm not sure what's going on, but I don't know if you're hearing me now, but based on the contents of our act, it suggests that it is fairly robust and should be able to deal with the vast majority of situations that are likely to arise in the modern context.
Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask, and this one goes to Kerry-Anny, because I know you've done a lot of work in the Caribbean. Now, having heard the whole question on harmonization of the law, and Bartlett explained how it would make some difference, and you mentioned the whole question of comparing apples to apples. Is it the role of the OAS, is it the role of your organization to try to seek that there's harmonization across the region? And what do you see from your perspective as the benefits that can accrue as a result of something like that happening?
That's a good question. So one of the things that a regional political body does do is offer that framework for harmonization. So there is a model law that the OAS has on data privacy. One exists. But in terms of being able to mandate it, it has to come from the member states as a mandate for this. It's not something that the General Secretariat, which is just the organization that manages all the mandates of the member states. The member states have to be the one to determine this. And I think it's a similar framework like CARICOM. If you understand that unless the mandate comes from the heads of CHOGM, unless CHOGM puts that down as a mandate, it will never be something that is just automatically done. What I can say that helps is it's important even at a global perspective that, as I said, if we're all speaking a similar language, that's what helps. I think how Bartlett puts it in terms of it doesn't, even if we don't all have the same legislation, but there's some mandate that comes down to say, hey, when it comes on to these tiers of breaches, we all need to be able to define them this way. I think even at a minimum level, thinking about a framework of cooperation on very serious, like public, what you call serious breaches that will come to the national attention or causes either a regional disaster, for example. Those kind of things is something I think that either at CHOGM level, OAS level can be discussed, but ultimately all these countries are sovereign. So unless they come together and actually determine it and decide this is something that, unfortunately, it's not something that can be mandated necessarily unless the heads of state decide to do it. So I think, Charles, just to answer your question, like in a very succinct way, it's really critical for cybersecurity incidents globally, which is why like the Budapest Convention, the new UN negotiated convention, all of those things are coming up because commonalities in references to breaches. Not when I might say I have a cyber incident, Bartlett might say it was a cyber attack. When I might say it was a zero-day vulnerability, someone might say, no, it was definitely someone hacking a patch that was not done. So you might have different ways of looking at the same thing, but it's in order to ensure data privacy and data protection and the regulators are able to do their job, it's commonality in terms of understanding the definitions of the things that we're speaking to. I hope that answers your question in a roundabout way.
Yes, and I'll come back. I'll follow up with another question for you, because in your presentation, you mentioned the whole question of the NIST framework and, possibly using that in terms of, I know we're talking about the implementation of procedures to comply with the law. Now, Bartlett, you can kick in because I know you're an experienced technologist as well. How useful then, in the absence of harmonized legislation, how useful will that be then, that type of framework across the region, if companies, let's use this as a standard for when we're implementing our data privacy programs?
So just at the base of it, one of the things with data privacy is, as I said, remember I identified the three things: confidentiality, integrity, availability. If a company begins to think about the data sets that they manage as data controllers under those umbrellas, then this frameworks help them with that. One, I have to identify this data that I'm responsible to keep confidential, intact, and available at all times. I have to put in a governance framework to know who within my organization is responsible for these data sets, because I've already disaggregated the data to understand what data sets need to be protected at a certain level. Then you think about control, which is the C within the NIST framework. Who has control and access? Do I give control and access to everyone for the same type of data, or based on the data sets I have given, Bartlett has control only to this level of data? And then when you think about communication, when something does happen, who do I speak to? Who do I need to talk to first? Do I know who within my organizations I just pretty much as a staff clicked on something that caused it to go, and confidential email to go to the wrong person? Something very simple and basic. I was typing in, it autofilled someone else's email and it went to the wrong person. Who was me? Like, who should I speak to first? So understanding communication within your organization, that will allow, it puts you on the path of compliance. And then last within this framework is thinking about protection. So when you think about protection, you think about security controls, you think about how do I put and ensure that the computers, the servers, whether it be man access, whether it be virtual access, who has access to the servers, how am I putting in security measures and control? So in short, Charles, it may not necessarily warrant that you're going to be in full compliance, but it puts you on a good path that is defendable. And I think it's always important with data protection to have a defendable position to say, I did all that I could. You may fall short, but at least you're on a path and your actions could serve. And Bartlett, I don't know what you think as a practitioner.
So what I would say very briefly is this: the NIST frameworks in general, and certainly their privacy framework, it's very practical, user-friendly, easy to use, but don't let the perceived simplicity of it, which is a good thing from a business perspective. It makes it easier to figure out what you just need to do without all the legalese and mumbo jumbo. Very good. And I'd recommend many of you on the call, if you have a chance, just Google NIST privacy framework, just look it up for yourself. It makes it so like relatable to figure out what you need to do from a privacy compliance perspective. Now, the one thing I'd mention briefly about it is that even in the absence of, for example, laws in your jurisdiction, as a private sector actor, a business, for example, if you were to use the NIST framework as your basis for your kind of compliance efforts around privacy, I think you'd be in good stead. And I say this because it's very easy to do a crosswalk between the requirements in the NIST framework and, like, as you've mentioned before, Charles, the GDPR, which is the so-called gold standard for privacy. It's very easy to do a crosswalk between them, and you'll see that essentially once you are largely compliant with what the NIST framework requires, for the most part, you're largely compliant with what regulations like the GDPR and by extension, even something like the Barbados Data Protection Act would require. And so I think I'll leave it there, but I think on balance, it's a very good thing for businesses to be mindful of regionally.
Okay. We were talking about harmonization. So there's one other question relative to harmonization across the region. And this question is, what role do you think CARICOM could play in the Caribbean data privacy space? And either of you can take that question.
I don't know if Kerry is allowed to answer those kind of questions. So thankfully, as a private person, I think I can speak to it, both from the perspective as a legal practitioner, but just as a CARICOM citizen and person. I was born and raised in one jurisdiction, and I'm living now and making my life in another. My family's here and so on. I think CARICOM potentially has a significant role to play, but it sort of harkens back to something that was discussed earlier, which is there has to be the political will of the individual governments to want this, or to put it another way, there has to be sufficient incentives for the government to say, hey, this is a good or useful idea for us to even get there. There is no question in my mind that obviously, given the existence of CARICOM and its overall approach and its legal structure and so on, it would perhaps be the perfect foundation to build out some kind of regional, I guess, framework or compliance type, effort or what have you. But I think the larger questions that we need to grapple with really center on will within the individual jurisdictions to do this kind of a thing.
And I could layer on, thanks for setting that foundation, Bartlett, and then my answer can be much easier and elevated to the regional perspective, because one of the amazing things between OAS and CARICOM is that we do have a great relationship in terms of implementing security related issues that affect the region. So I think even from a privacy protection, if you think about CARICOM implementing the single ICT space, CARICOM can think about security from design, and security from design does include thinking about privacy as a foundational part of that security by design. So I think as a regional organization, holistically, with the kind of mandates that CARICOM has given already in the past, over the past few years, whether it be the cybersecurity and cybercrime strategy, whether it be the single ICT space mandates, whether it be the different groups of ministers that meet and can actually discuss these issues at a pragmatic level. I think it's an excellent, what I would say, forum. That's how the OAS even looks at itself, is that we offer the space and the forum to discuss these issues on a pragmatic level between competencies within each of our member states' governments. And I think it's a good foundation to begin the discussion at a minimum.
Yep. Agreed.
I just want to follow up, because since we're talking about this whole question of CARICOM, I know earlier you mentioned the role of the individual in terms of their part in data protection. Now, since we are speaking the CARICOM, what then is the role, or what can be the role of individual persons within each respective company or respective country to ensure that their government is not only just implementing the legislation, but what role can they play in terms of agitating for maybe taking an approach to the harmonization that we were talking about?
I mean, I could probably switch hats a little bit, take off the OAS banner in the back, switch hats for a second. Just from a very practical individual, when I was working with the government of Trinidad and Tobago and the Freedom of Information Act came out, I remember we were bombarded with requests from individuals. And that alone forced us to start to think about all the different frameworks within each ministry to be able to ensure that when a freedom of information request comes in, that person's data is actually sorted out. We had legal opinions being written at the same time. And I think it's a similar thing when you think about your data privacy and protection rights as an individual. I think the more we educate the citizens of their rights as a data owner, and they understand what their role is within the legislation and the role of the persons who are their data controllers, I think I've seen our CARICOM citizens, they exercise their rights once they know the right exists. And I said, I can only use the Freedom of Information Act because I saw it was like a rapid uptake across the region and people exercised that right that they had to access their own data. So I think that's the preface I would give. And Bartlett, I don't know if you had.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, really. The truth is, it's I mean, I don't want to sound overly, hyperbolic, but it's really a case of power to the people. If people feel have enough information to know that something is useful or valuable, then the people within the jurisdiction will start asking the questions themselves, but they need that information first. And I think that's where the question turns to, well, whose role is it to give them that information? Is it the government itself, or is it also the role of civil society, the ISSAs and the BIPAs to help to spread that awareness so that persons in Barbados, for example, are aware of the whole basket load of rights that they now have with this new act. Because if you don't know, and it's just one of those access in the back somewhere, then it makes no real difference. Nobody's going to be agitating for anything. Nobody's going to be asking, or even take it outside of Barbados, in a country where, for example, there isn't an act as yet, or perhaps a government has passed an act, but it hasn't been put in force, which is the case in a number of jurisdictions in the region. If people are generally aware that this thing called privacy is a thing, and 2, it's important, and 3, you actually can make the connection to them and their personal lives, then that's when you start having those conversations at the grassroots level. And once those conversations start, that's when things foment and people start making and agitating on their own or via civil society organizations for the kinds of change that they want. I tell my friends the best thing that could have ever happened in terms of like privacy sensitization was those like documentaries about like Snowden and Facebook and so on that came out recently, because all of a sudden everybody got it. They're like, oh, that's why information is so powerful. you know, and for years, those of us in, you know, as practitioners, as lawyers and privacy and cybersecurity professionals, you try saying it to your family and friends, and their eyes would just go to the back of their heads like, oh, what are we talking about again about this, blah, blah, blah. But then they saw these documentaries and these movies, and they're like, oh, I get it. You know, and that was a good example of where, you know, you make it accessible to everyday people so they understand why this thing is important, and then suddenly the conversations start happening. You get those conversations happening within your population, that's when things start being pushed further up the chain. And you find governments deciding, okay, well, perhaps this is important from that perspective. There's a next side to this thing that has nothing to do with private citizens, but as your question was really about private citizens, I'll leave it there.
Okay, there's a comment that I want to share, and it relates to the whole question of NIST. And this comment says that the NIST data protection framework uses element of the NIST cybersecurity framework, and hence will define clear guidelines that each data processor must follow for compliance. And it goes on to say, now is where government will have to get their privacy and cybersecurity houses in order. And that comment leads me to this particular question. And this one has to do, does the Barbados Act cover the procedure if breaches stem from governmental agencies or departments or only private entities?
Yes. Yeah, yes. So one of the things that I find interesting about the Barbados Act, and which is I think a very good thing, is that it holds governmental entities to the same standards as the private sector. And I think that's very important and very powerful, because it creates a level playing field where, as a citizen, you can feel that if something goes wrong with a governmental actor as distinct from a private business in your community or wherever, that you have the same level of redress underneath the Barbados Act. So yes, it applies equally to governmental actors and the private sector.
You know, for the skeptics in the room, some persons will, you know, we've now had a regulator recently appointed, and she was on the session with us this evening. So some persons will ask, how can the government regulator police the government department which hires her? So even though you're saying that the government is subject to the same regulation, but the government has appointed a regulator to oversee compliance of that particular legislation, how do you see that working? I'm going to put you on the spot, Bartlett, in this particular one. How do you see that working?
Well, I carry no brief, so to speak, so I'll be very pointed. If you look at privacy frameworks generally in the region, one of the things that you'll notice in quite a few of them, but not all, is that it speaks specifically to the independence of the regulator. And I think that's a very important building block for an effective privacy enforcement regime. If the regulator doesn't have a certain level of independence, then it limits the ability of the regulator to act in a sure-footed and confident way, regardless of who has breached the act. And I think it's sufficient to leave it there.
Okay, the next comment speaks to one that you mentioned earlier in terms of the whole process of education, and who will take responsibility for education of the masses around the whole data privacy. So this question deals with, how soon will the new data commissioner start the awareness and education of the private sector? So this person is assuming that it is the role and responsibility of the data commissioner to do the education and awareness. Now, I'm not sure, Bartlett, if you're privy to the roles and responsibility of the data commissioner, but is this one of her particular roles, education and awareness?
So the short answer is yes. If the act itself, I think, is useful in that it spells out with a high level of specificity exactly what the regulator should be doing or can do. And broadly speaking, a lot of those itemized matters speak to basically sensitization or awareness of the different publics, different communities and so on, about privacy rights and privacy obligations. So yes, the act does require it. But obviously, what I would say is, the regulator can't act in a vacuum. And so one will hope that the government will see the importance of sufficiently providing the regulator with the resources that the regulator will need to be effective in doing things like sensitizing the public.
Charles, you're muted.
Sorry, this question deals with the fact that since we are going to be looking to, become compliant with the regulations, this one is asking, can we expect an increase, or can businesses expect an increase in the cost of doing business to meet these compliance requirements? And they're looking at the whole question of audits and hiring consultants for data privacy. Can business expect that there will be a increasing cost of doing business?
Bartlett, if you mind, I could give a more global perspective to that answer, and then probably the localized answer after. I think one of the things that the GDPR had taught businesses is that it comes with a fine. So you have to kind of think, do you want to increase your costs after the fact, or do you want to put just best business practices in place beforehand to actually safeguard you from the fines that are coming after? So I think from just a more macro level, businesses have to really weigh out what is the cost benefit analysis to them actually putting in the measures in place at the onset, instead of waiting for something to come after, because the requirements of the legislation, such as the Data Protection Act of Barbados, actually gives you a very good foundation to be able to say to people, hey, you can do business with me because I'm compliant. So there's also a flip side to say that if you're more compliant, businesses globally, you could say, hey, I'm compliant as well with the Barbados Act, ergo I'm almost compliant with the GDPR. You can do better business with me in Barbados. It could increase your cost benefit analysis at a macro level, is something I would encourage businesses to look at.
Bartlett?
Yeah, I would only say, when I was growing up in Jamaica, my mother used to say to me, good thing not cheap and cheap thing not good. So yes, sorry, I think I just muted myself. Yes, having a meaningful compliance program in place, I think, is going to require you to look at your bottom line, because it is going to impact it. You are going to have to, I think, depend on the size and scope of your operations. So that's the sliding scale there. Depending on the size and scope of your operations, it is more likely than not it's going to impact it somehow. I don't think it's going to be as horrendous as we might imagine, or but the reality is it is going to impact you. And I think Kerry-Anny was right on the money, but you have to balance it, benefits of spending this extra money versus not spending it and not having any kind of a compliance program in place. And then something does go wrong, you get audited by the regulator and you have these sizable fines on top of, because you didn't want to spend X amount of money. You're paying a significant larger sum compared to that small X sum that you didn't want to spend to put together a compliance program.
Okay, this next question looks at the how we'll be able to do business with some of the larger countries where data protection legislation is in place. And the person is basically saying that, in terms of the Caribbean as a region, we are a little behind in terms of data security in totality, and not only limited to a legal framework, but even best practices. So how will this affect our continued ability to do business and trade with the larger, more advanced blocs like the European Union et al., especially in particularly sensitive areas such as finance?
If I just to probably give a short reaction to the question, rather, I don't know if I can answer the question in totality, but those businesses that do business with countries in Europe or in the US or wherever it is globally are having to be compliant already because the GDPR has been in place. And I think most companies had started to retrofit themselves to ensure that they could continue to do businesses. So I think that would be my short reaction, that I think because of the global impact of GDPR, those companies are already beginning to be compliant because they don't have a choice, kind of, once they manage any kind of data sets that flows outside of the EU.
Absolutely. And I think we're already seeing the reality of that in different organizations here in Barbados, where in the past, I would say 4 years ago, I would never be seeing things like data privacy agreements coming across my desk. Today, those things are commonplace because businesses in Barbados are doing business with entities outside of Barbados, in Europe, in Canada, and so on, in certain industries in the US, that do have regulations that say, well, if you're going to do anything where the data is sent to some country, and in this case, Barbados, you need to ensure that there's certain safeguards in place. And so essentially, now Barbados businesses are increasingly being asked to sign off on these agreements where you represent that, yes, I'm doing the bare minimum at the very least in terms of putting certain safeguards and security mechanisms in place, that kind of a thing. And so what you find is even if there was no Barbados Data Protection Act, companies in Barbados with a kind of international focus or outlook, they're being pulled up, whether they want to go up there or not. And so I think that's how the kind of international framework is impacting things. And I don't know if that constitutes an answer, but to use Kerry's word, it's the best reaction that comes up from me when I hear the question.
Okay. One other question here. Well, the law was enacted, the Barbados Data Protection Act was enacted and proclaimed, and now we have the appointment of the data commissioner. So things seem to be rolling along. The next question on most people's mind is how soon or how much longer do they have to be compliant? And so, this question is asking both of you, what really is a realistic time frame that we could expect to use not only in Barbados, but as, to step up and for the companies to get compliant? What can we expect, and what would you say is a realistic time frame? Or is that a hard one?
It's not hard, but it's one of those questions where there's the right answer and the truth. The right answer is, well, realistically, usually when an act, privacy act, comes into force, usually there's like a sort of period of like 1 to 2 years where businesses are allowed to get their houses in order. Mm-hmm. That's the right answer to the question. The truth is, on the face of our act in Barbados, that period doesn't exist. And so technically speaking, the strict answer to that question is, well, pretty much March 30th, 2021 is when you should have been compliant. And so that is the reality of it. I cannot speak for Commissioner Graves. I imagine with the fullness of time, she'll settle into the role and have a sense of what her objectives are and what is prioritized. But if I were to guess and imagine, I would assume that perhaps I think things like enforcing in a strict sense of breaches of the act, I don't imagine that would be the biggest priority right now. I would have to imagine that the priorities would be things like, resource issues and sensitization of the public, those kind of things, which could take a reasonable amount of time. Putting things like facilities in place and so on to, facilitate a registry, that kind of stuff. So I don't imagine that the hard enforcement, as we imagine when we hear about GDPR and this company got fined, this and that and what have you, I don't think that should be happening in the short to medium term, in my view.
And just to follow on with, without answering the question directly, answering it indirectly, when GDPR was coming out, it had a 2-year warning from EU and companies went into a panic. And when I read a lot of articles since then, in the wake of GDPR coming into being, there's still room for the regulators to be able to do all the things they need to do to check everyone. So if you think about the EU trying to check the globe for compliance, it's not something that can happen overnight. And I would hope that, just as Bartlett has gracefully put it, that the data commissioner for Barbados would be allowed that similar room to be able to recognize that she won't be able to do everything at the same time. Recognize that globally, it's not even possible for persons who have more, I guess, experience with the GDPR being in place since 2018. So I think that's the more indirectly answering the question as well.
Okay, and just time for one other question. There are 2 questions on ransomware that I'm going to hold over until the next section. But this last question is, this person is asking, what is the recourse for breaches caused by entities operating outside of the Barbados jurisdictions, such as the global social media companies, where user account details and information were compromised? So what is the recourse of local persons against international companies that have our data, going into cyberspace, and persons accessing that data?
So, I mean, this again, it falls in line with one of those right answer versus truth type things. The right answer is the same recourse that exists for Barbados-bound or established business that processes your personal data. It's the same thing that applies to an entity outside of Barbados that basically targets Barbadian persons with its, business, its products and offerings, that kind of a thing. And so strictly, it's more or less a level playing field. That I think is the right answer to the question.
Kerry-Anny, you wanted to add anything to that before we wrap up this section?
No, I think I'll opine to Bartlett because spot on.
Okay, so we've come to the end of this particular section on data privacy, and we want to thank Kerry-Anny and Bartlett for doing your presentations and also ably answering the questions. So I would take it upon me on behalf of all the audience to say thank you